Good afternoon, everyone, if you're in Europe, and welcome to this CoreMD webinar. As you may know, we have a series of these. This specific webinar will be available with the others on our website in due course. My name is Alan Fraser. I'm the scientific coordinator of this consortium funded by the European Union through a Horizon Europe grant. And I want to highlight that this is being conducted through Zoom in lecture mode. So the audience, the participants are not able to speak to us, but we really do welcome interaction, and we ask you to put questions in the Q&A. There is a chat box as well, so that if you have issues for our moderator, please, that can be used, reserved for that function. We would like questions to be asked through the Q&A, and we will try and moderate that and monitor it and also look at comments so that we can address them in the discussion. The webinar is planned for 75 minutes. If there is a lot of questions, we may continue for up to 90 minutes. Finally, if you would like to follow our project, you can visit our website and subscribe to the newsletter to see what is being done within the whole consortium. As I've said, this is one in a series, and we've listed here the webinars that we've held this year. That QR code will take you directly to the website that is listed on this slide, and all of these are available for review afterwards. So let me come to today's topic and webinar. We're going to discuss providing high-risk medical devices for children, problems and proposals. I think we're all aware that within Europe now there are issues about device availability, particularly for children, and because or related to the new medical device regulation and its implementation. And so one of the tasks within our project was called Recommendations Concerning High-Risk Medical Devices in Children. This was led by Professor Berthold Koletzko from Munich University and the European Academy of Paediatrics. And one of his team, Kathrin Gürlich, is a research assistant who's conducted a systematic review of evidence for high-risk medical devices in children from the scientific literature. So we will start with her summary of her study. We will come back to Berthold Koletzko later in the session for the recommendations that have been prepared by the CoreMD consortium. And in the middle of the presentations, I'm pleased to welcome also Marc Gewillig, who is a pediatric cardiologist from the University of Leuven in Belgium, and who leads for structural interventions and devices for the Association for European Pediatric Cardiology. And he will give us the perspective of a practicing clinical academic cardiologist involved in structural interventions from the new medical device regulation and what is happening with device availability. And then after these presentations from Europe, I'm pleased also to welcome Rachel Neubrander, who's director of the Division of Circulatory Support, Structural and Vascular Devices for CDRH, which is the Center for Devices and Radiological Health within the FDA in the USA. And she's responsible for structural devices, both for adults and children. And it'll be most useful and interesting to hear her perspective because of the different arrangements that are possible within the USA. So that's the end of my introduction. I will stop sharing my slides, and it's my pleasure now to ask Kathrin Gürlich to present her summary of her study.
Okay, so it's a pleasure for me to present to you the results of the scoping review that we have conducted within the CoreMD project on behalf of the European Academy of Pediatrics. The title of the scoping review that we have conducted is Evidence from Clinical Trials on High-Risk Medical Devices in Children. In Europe, the regulation for approval of medical devices changed to improve the safety for patients by increasing the regulatory requirements. However, meeting these increased regulatory requirements can be challenging for manufacturers, especially for the clinical investigation of devices that are intended for pediatric patients. It is often difficult to perform adequately powered clinical studies in children because numbers of patients are limited, events are rare, and there is a lot of heterogeneity between pediatric patients. Also, ethical aspects and parental concerns can make it difficult to recruit children to trials. An additional barrier faced by manufacturers are the high financial regulatory costs in Europe. And all these factors together may result in market withdrawal of innovative medical devices for children, and also in a lack of investment in further development of new pediatric medical devices. So the challenge is to obtain the best possible documentation of safety and efficacy for medical devices that are used in children, but at the same time also provide and secure the access to innovative medical devices for children. As part of the CoreMD project, we systematically summarized, published evidence from clinical trials on high-risk medical devices in children to identify and describe methodologies applied in this research area. We registered and published our review protocol at Open Science Framework. So if you are interested to read more, you can have a look there. Studies were eligible for our review if they included a pediatric population covering the age range from birth to under 21 years of age. Studies with mixed populations, including both children and adults, were also eligible. We had no restrictions in terms of study setting, and we included clinical trials of any design. So, for example, non-randomized and randomized controlled clinical trials, crossover trials, or before and after studies. Observational studies were excluded from our review. We focused our interest on the clinical fields of diabetology, cardiology, orthopedics, and surgery because of feasibility reasons and because this was also in line with similar reviews done by the CoreMD consortium focusing on adult populations. The focus of our review was on high-risk medical devices. We included class 3 medical devices according to the definition of the FDA from the US, and class 3 implantable devices and class 2B active devices according to the MDR definition from Europe. One challenge was that there is no central database of medical devices in Europe. Therefore, we decided to develop a list of high-risk pediatric devices based on FDA sources. And based on this list, we developed a search strategy for 2 databases, Embase and Medline. And our search timeframe was from January 2017 to November 2022. We identified 1,692 records in our search. We did title and abstract screening and full text screening and included 99 trials in our review with 104 reports. 90% of the included trials were conducted in countries of very high human development index, mainly in North America and Europe. 65% of the trials were multi-center. Of those, 73% were conducted within one country and 27% enrolled participants from different countries. Most of the included trials in our sample evaluated the use of medical devices from the clinical specialty of diabetology, followed by cardiology. We identified no trial that evaluated the use of a high-risk medical device from the field of orthopedics or surgery. 60 trials enrolled only pediatric populations, and the remaining trials evaluated the device of interest in a mixed population consisting both children and adults. Within the trial with mixed populations, 64% reported the exact number of children, with a proportion ranging from 10 to 89%. Most of the trials included children and adolescents, followed by adolescents and children only. 3 trials included a broader age range, including also infants, and 1 trial included neonates. 38% of the included trials were randomized controlled trials, followed by before and after studies and crossover trials. Of all controlled trials and crossover trials, 90% were randomized, and all crossover trials and most of the RCTs were open label studies, with blinding applied in 13% of all RCTs. The sample size varied across the trials and ranged from 10 to 1,000 participants. Most of the included trials were small, with a median number of participants of 59, and 64% of trials had a sample size below 100 participants. Most of the trials assessed efficacy and effectiveness of the device used and safety of the device. Patient-reported outcomes and performance of the device were assessed in about 1/4 of the trials, and usability was examined only in studies from the field of diabetology. 75% of the trials were fully or partly industry funded, meaning that they received devices from industry for free or at a discounted price. To summarize, our review provides an overview on the science and methodologies applied in a systematically selected sample of recent clinical trials that evaluated high-risk medical devices in children. We could see that in our assessed sample, clinical trials were mostly multi-center, performed with small sample sizes. Our sample was dominated by devices from the clinical specialty of diabetology, and just very few trials evaluated a device from the field of cardiology. Trials were mostly performed in adolescents or older children, with a low number in infants and younger children. And variable study designs were used, often without concurrent control groups. And these findings reflect the barriers in obtaining clinical evidence in this age group. As already mentioned in the beginning, both ethical aspects and parental concerns can make it difficult to enroll children in clinical studies, especially younger children, also because of limited number of patients available and because events are rare. What can we conclude from the review? We could see that pediatric devices require specific considerations and have unique barriers to their development. And we hope that these findings may assist regulators and competent authorities in setting achievable and context-tailored requirements for clinical evidence supporting device conformity. If you are interested to read more about our review, the results were recently published in the journal Pediatric Research. That's everything from my side. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Kathrin. And while you're closing your screen, I appreciate that this was a 5-year sample, which you did for logistic reasons, I think.
Exactly, yes.
Also found a rather high proportion of randomized trials compared with our other core MD reviews of cardiovascular and orthopedic devices. And you think this is related to the fact that most of them were in diabetes?
Probably, yes, because diabetes is a disease with a higher prevalence compared to diseases from the cardiology field. So I think that it's maybe easier to conduct RCTs in the field of diabetology. So I guess that this is one of the reasons, yes.
So you and your colleagues were looking for quite rare devices and all devices, but found that most studies that were published were for fairly common diseases, I think. But let us move now. Thank you very much for your contribution. Let us move now to Marc Gewillig, who's going to give us his perspective of the use of devices that are perhaps much less frequently used. Marc, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Alan. First of all, I would like to thank indeed the organizers for inviting me to share some ideas. First of all, disclosure statement. As you see, indeed, I have some relationships as a proctor with some of the companies, which you can read over here. If you look a little bit more carefully, I mean, Medtronic, Venus, Edwards, Abbott are big companies that have very specific items, which typically are rather costly. They vary between 5,000 and 20,000 euros a device, and high volume loads. That means that these companies are more or less not very much hampered by the new MDR regulation. Exception to this list is NUMED, but I mean, I will come with some data, some examples, and I leave it up to you to see whether I'm really biased or not. As already has been mentioned, we all know that MDD from MDR, MDD was perceived as being light touch with high variability throughout Europe and a little bit too easy in some countries, and it was vulnerable for fraud and corruption. That's why MDR decided to go much, much more thorough, and over there, first rule, safety was first, with much more data on safety, efficacy, and long-term data, and also much more control on production and distribution. So already you can predict with this list of wishes that it will take much more time, and indeed, the application of MDR, the deadline has been postponed several times, and right now everything should be up and running by 27, 28, but also much, much more expensive, and that's where the problem does arise enormously. For instance, safety first. If we go for a 100% guarantee and no risk treatment, I think every clinician will know and can confirm that that is almost impossible. And if you try to obtain that, cost will rise exponentially. And also, if you go for more control, we must say that everything will depend on the level of control that you want to obtain. And currently, we have the impression that there is very little trust between the law and the people in the field. The level of trust is more set at the level of fraud and corruption. But allow me to explain that a little bit later. A typical example in our field is, for instance, the Rashkind balloon. Last year, the last balloons that could perform this procedure were sold in Europe and were used. And so for a couple of months, there were almost no balloons available of this item. Now, what do we use this balloon for? It's only used or predominantly used in patients with transposition of the great arteries. That is a rare disease. I mean, here you see the number of births, and it happens with the birth rate in Europe almost once for 350,000 inhabitants per year in Europe. So in other words, something very rare. It allows us, however, to go through the umbilicus, through the heart, and inflate the balloon here in the left atrium, inflate the balloon, pull it back and make a big tear in this septum so that blue and red blood can mix. And that allows us to save the baby, because the babies born with this can become very, very blue in minutes after birth. They will have an oxygen deficiency, which will result very fast in brain damage. By doing this, we can save their brain and do the operation electively with our A team. If this balloon is not available, you can imagine what needs to be done. We will have to go for urgent surgery or something, typically in the night, and we have to work with our B team, and that means much, much more complications, or we would have to relieve all the, give birth to all the children with cesarean, so that the team would be ready. How did Europe solve this problem for the time being? Well, we got a derogation in several countries of a new FDA-approved balloon. I mean, this type of balloon doesn't have MDD nor MDR in Europe, but every 6 months we need to get a new derogation in order to be able to use this balloon throughout Europe. I can tell you this is not fun to work like this. Another problem that has shown is here tissue. It's pericardial patch, which got its MDR certification last year. It is a product that is already on the market for several years. Over 16,000 patches have been implanted without one serious complaint concerning safety or device. Now, the process from MDD to MDR for this patch, for instance, you see here the number of pages, the number of documents, but focus on this price, 811,000 euros only on invoices. So that doesn't count for the extra cost that the company had to do with their own employees and things like that. This company had a second product. So, I mean, it's a small company with limited devices. And they still did not apply for MDR on the device. They still have to recover first from this price. But these were two typical examples. Here, a list of devices that already left the European market by October 22. So here, the Rashkin balloons that I mentioned, two companies already had backed out earlier, so-called for a production problem, but I mean, it was clear that they didn't want to go through the MDR. And so when the third company then stopped selling it, then there was a serious problem. But the same thing has happened already with stents. Here, for instance, renal stents that we use in pulmonary arteries, coils that are detachable, again, renal stents that we use in different places. Specific catheters made for newborns and for very small infants, which already have left the European market. Here, a list of devices of which we know that the company has decided not to apply for MDR because they are way too much afraid of the running costs in order to get that certification. Here, for instance, a catheter that we use for diagnostic and which makes interventions much more easy and safer. Different sheets from different companies. Again, a drain, catheters, pacing wires, all devices made in very small quantities for very, very specific use in very, very specific diseases. But also what we have seen is that devices that are already, for instance, available in the United States, the company told us that they will not seek MDR regulation because of the running cost, and it would be way too expensive. Of particular interest is here the robot surgery for intracardiac surgery. The company already let know that they will not seek MDR regulation. Why? Because it would be way too expensive and they would have to go for MDR for all the indications of their devices. So in other words, in 2024, not a single surgical team in Europe will be able to perform intracardiac robotic surgery anymore, which is a sad thing to see. Some companies have warned us that some of their devices may disappear, and that still depends on the running costs that they are experiencing right now. And indeed, some of these companies have confirmed by now that indeed in the coming years, in the coming months, they will no longer keep it available on the market. very sadly, for instance, two types of stents that were designed and developed for babies so that they could outgrow their stent and be adapted during growth have been stopped from production, stopped from further research because the costs were way too high. If we want to see then what kind of costs are we talking about, here that is a slide I got from an American company working in Europe. I mean, they work in States, Canada, Japan, so they can compare a little bit what's going on. The running cost for 5 years under MDD to keep one of their lines available was $15,200 for that line. Their estimation in June 22 was that it would exceed $140,000, but a recent estimation showed that that line would cost them more than $200,000 in order to get their MDR certification. This company has 10 lines. I think everybody can calculate how much money they will have to pay. The other thing is, for instance, also in MDR, the cost to keep it on the market, they will have to accept at least 20 days control every year, which again will go with staggering costs. If you compare now, for instance, the same product being made available in the United States, Canada, or Europe, the cost in the United States, if they go for a class 2, I mean, that's the comparable thing, is here you see the price, and with a 30-day, I mean, that's very fast, but I mean, you will see one of the conditions is that people can talk with the FDA before they start the whole process. In Canada, it is somewhat more expensive with an annual cost of this, so that is slightly more, but I mean, still acceptable. This is the cost that the company did estimate early this year for that specific line with all the comparable costs. So it really shows that Europe here is sticking out with its cost enormously. European law obliges the notified bodies to come up with their costs on their website. And indeed, every notified body has a website with the costs on it. However, if you compare these costs with the final invoices, I mean, they can change with a factor, I repeat, a factor of 10 to 15 of the broadcasted prices. So that means that we do have very big problems with getting devices through the notified bodies into MDR. And what are the reasons? Well, we can list a few. Notified bodies, for instance, are private organizations. I mean, like any organization, they must make profit, and that is very big difference with the FDA, for instance. FDA is a government organization, non-profit. It's paid by the American government. Notified body in Europe, the way it's designed, is one big responsibility. It has to guarantee safety of the device, but it has no obligation to meet a medical need or to put a good device on the market within a reasonable time and a reasonable price. By the way, FDA, as far as we understand the American law, has that obligation. What we note when dealing with notified bodies is that they have a clear aversion of risk. It appears that those companies are run by lawyers, or if you communicate with them, you always get lawyers, not scientists nor clinicians. And I don't know if you have experience with working with lawyers, but they hate risk, and they are not used to work with risk management. What was surprising also when we go through the experience of the different companies is that there is no control on those notified bodies, no control the way they interpret the legislation, on their price, on their efficiency. And there, for instance, a company that has several lines with for every line the same degree of sterilization, for instance, well, every line will be checked separately by different people, which is not very logical, but makes the cost extremely high. There is a way of recertification by national authorities and also by the European Commission every so many years. However, specifically, they do not check on price, they do not check on invoices, and they do not check on devices that did not make it. it appears that there is an extreme disbalance in power between the notified bodies and the companies. For instance, if there is a problem, there is no ombudsman, no referee. You cannot ask questions. If you want to change, it will be extremely expensive, and because all the notified bodies are overworked because they cannot hardly meet their deadlines, I mean, you put yourself in a waiting line of at least 3 to 4 years before you will get your MDR. And last but not least, with the way the European law is written, pre-consultation is forbidden. That was to avoid shopping, and the original idea is good, but I mean, it means that you cannot have any discussion to have an idea what's going to be going on. So where do we think solutions could come from? Well, the next speaker will talk us about it, but what we have to realize is, if you talk to European politicians, they say, if you want to amend the law, the cycle will take at least 7 years before anything seriously will change on the MDR legislation. So one of the options we have is to make subcategories. And here, for instance, the orphan devices could give a solution, partly at the condition that, for instance, we could work with conditional acceptance with limited data, use of expert panels and registries, but also the notified bodies themselves will have to change a little bit, or the way they are controlled, designed, and what their final goal is. And last but not least, as things are more regulated, nowadays we start to realize that we do a lot of off-label use in pediatric cardiology. To be honest, 63% of the patients we are treating in interventional cardiology is with off-label devices, or devices for off-label indications. For instance, 99% of the stents we use are off-label. The stent currently is only labeled for use in coarctation, but we use it all over the place in different positions, different pathologies, which are all each single one off-label. Also, if we do a simple balloon dilation, a balloon is only on label in these indications over here in children. So all the other indications are off label, which makes new legislation on all these items much more difficult. And then last but not least, also the orphan device, if we want to go on it, big problems. I mean, we have now already been talking over a year with the lawmakers, what would be the number, what is the definition, and so we still have not agreed on a number. Still various numbers are running around, but once we then start to talk what would be the advantage of an orphan device, especially in an off-label use, well, we see that regulators are very uncomfortable with the definitions and with the use of that. Also, you can be off-label because of the indication, the age, size, the pressure you're working in, the safety class you work. We have to realize that many of the devices that we use off-label, the labeled indication for a device may have become, in the meantime, outdated or obsolete, but it is still the primary indication for us, or the only option that we have for some of the diseases that we have been treating for the last decades in these patients. And also, it is not uncommon that we use a device in one class and would like to use it, or have been using it the last couple of years in another class, which is a complete nightmare for regulators as they see what we have been doing. So even coming by with regulating what we have been doing the last couple of years remains a big problem. And that are the biggest ideas I wanted to share with you about the orphan devices, or the devices for orphan diseases that we have been seeing disappearing, or that are threatened to disappear in the next coming months. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marc. And you've presented problems from the perspective of European pediatric cardiology. I think there are some things that you said where probably regulators would have a different view about some details, and we can come back to Rachel in the general discussion about how the FDA is funded. I think, as you know, we have been invited to join the Orphan Devices Task Force. I think Bert will talk about that as well. But the next meeting is tomorrow, and we may have a definition of orphan devices shared with us after that. But probably, if you agree, the best thing would be to go on to hear Bert now present proposals from our consortium, and then we can have a general discussion. And I encourage colleagues online to use the Q&A to send us your questions and comments for the discussion. Please, Berthold, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to discuss this important topic. My job is now easy because Kathrin has already shared the challenges with clinical evaluation, where there's very limited conclusive data for devices used in infants and children and for devices used in small numbers. And Marc has clearly pointed out the challenges that exist with market access of these products. So our job in the Core MD project was to review these challenges and then come up with recommendations both for clinical evaluation and for certification for market access for medical devices that are used in the pediatric age groups. And we did this on behalf of the European Academy of Pediatrics, which is the umbrella organization that speaks for 52 national pediatric associations across Europe and 14 pediatric subspecialty organizations. So basically, we speak for all of pediatrics and child health across Europe. I have no conflict of interest in this area. I have no funding by any commercial entity related to medical devices. So you've heard about the background already. We've heard that the new medical device regulation markedly increases the time and cost for bringing medical devices to the market or keeping them on the market, which is particularly challenging for those devices that are sold only in small numbers. And Marc has very nicely pointed out that we face an increasing disappearance of essential pediatric and orphan medical devices that we need for appropriate care of sick children. So we said, we reviewed the evidence. Kathrin had shared part of that and said we need to bring experts together to develop recommendations on how to go forward. And so we invited pediatric and other related medical associations, regulators, the European Commission, and renowned individual experts to join an expert panel. We shared information that we gathered with the people who agreed to join, invited them to a face-to-face meeting where we discussed all these issues in great detail. We organized an additional online meeting, and in between had a lot of digital communication by email and other means, and then developed conclusions that were adopted by consensus. They were published and disseminated further. So this is the recommendations that we came up with, which are published in this year in the Journal of Acta Pediatrica. And I want to emphasize that we had 24 medical associations who backed up these recommendations. And that is really something. If you are working in this field, you know how individual medical associations are. And if there's 24 medical associations joining together and supporting joint recommendations, I think that's a very strong signal. We also had a regulatory authority and a participant from the Directorate General Health and Food Safety of the European Commission, who, however, for formal and political reasons, could not sign the recommendations, which is understandable probably for everybody. So with respect to clinical investigations, we concluded there's no one-size-fits-all solution. We cannot have one and the same approach to clinical investigation of all medical devices. It depends really on the research question, the type of MDE, the identification of potential hazards and expected risks, the nature and the prevalence of the conditions, and the age group, which would determine what kind of medical approach for clinical investigation is feasible. You heard from Kathrin already that the devices for diabetic patients, which are pretty much the same in adults and in adolescents, clearly can be evaluated in randomized clinical trials. Others, like the ones that Marc referred to, it will not be feasible to do a controlled clinical trial. So while RCTs are the gold standard in children, for most MDs, these are not feasible for ethical and feasibility reasons, and we must consider other study designs. And of course, we want to strive for the highest clinical level of clinical evidence that is achievable, but have to decide on a case-to-case basis. Mixed population studies with both adults and children included can optimize sample sizes and resource use if there is a shared indication for medical device use. And that, of course, should include age-specific subgroup analyses. Extrapolation of data from trials in adults may be considered for devices with the same intended use in children if the condition that is treated is similar and if there's no indication for fundamental differences in effectiveness and safety in different age groups. We believe, however, that for many devices, probably one needs a conditional approval for market introduction and then a post-marketing surveillance. And for these, we believe we need suitable patient registries, which should be supervised not by industry, but by competent pediatric association, and that are set up to systematically collect relevant and formative data on pediatric patients that are treated with the MDs of interest. We have a number of existing registries. Most of them have been set up for very different purposes. And so we need to agree on what the minimal requirements are for such registries to use them for post-marketing surveillance. We need to define and enhance quality of the existing ones and establish new ones. And we need to discuss also how these should be funded. And we have some suggestions for securing funding both from public and private sources. We strongly recommend to establish an expert panel on pediatric medical devices with pediatric experts. We believe that the decisions and advice to be produced cannot be done without pediatric experts that know what these things are about. Just engineers and lawyers will not be able to take rational decisions on these questions. This expert panel should provide scientific and clinical advice to developers and of new and high-risk medical devices. They need to know what to expect and what kind of data they are requested to document, and also to the European Medical Device Coordination Group with respect to consistent application of the MDR and MD for children. We are not happy that so far there is no consistent communication with the MDCG, with the pediatric community, and we really need to move forward there. We also think that the current system of the many notified bodies is not suitable for addressing the specific questions on pediatric medical devices. Rather, we need a limited number of notified bodies that are focusing on the specific issues of pediatric and orphan devices, and they need to be required to seek advice from competent pediatric experts. We need more transparency with the advice of expert panels, and also we request that the clinical data provided by manufacturers need to be made transparent to ensure predictable evidence requirements and clinicians having access to these data. We think there is ways to achieve this without violating the justified intellectual property rights of manufacturers. Alan, you just said there is a discussion on what an orphan medical device should be. We have recommended that this should be decided on a case-by-case basis, using the accepted definition of an orphan disease that is laid down in the European legislation with a prevalence of less than 1 per 2,000 people, plus the existence of an unmet medical need, and thirdly, absent or insufficient suitable or equivalent alternative therapeutic options. And if these three criteria are met, then an orphan MD status could be assigned, which should then lead to a facilitated evaluation and market access with a shorter time frame and a limited cost. Until we have a solution, and this may take time, we really need interim solutions, because at present we are faced with the challenge that essential devices are disappearing from the market. The goal must be to ensure continued access to essential pediatric and orphan medical devices for our patients. We also think we need to establish systematic monitoring on medical devices that are about to disappear or have already disappeared from the market. You may know that in the pharmaceutical space, there's an obligation for manufacturers to notify if they withdraw a product. That's not the case for medical devices. At the moment, European Commission depends on voluntary notification by medical associations, which is not a good system, and it comes too late, because we only realize the problem when the devices have already disappeared, which is too late. We clearly need to implement an efficient and fast process to assign a pediatric and orphan device status, and that must result into a simplified, fast, and low-cost conformity assessment. In addition to that, because many MDs for rare indications are not really profitable for manufacturers, we need proactive support for bringing MDs to the market, for developing, evaluating, and certification such MDs, as has been established for pediatric and orphan drugs, with public funding and other incentives. And we suggest that until a final solution is achieved, a pragmatic solution could be that pediatric and orphan devices that have been marketed for at least 3 years without reported problems should just get permission for continued use, and MDs approved with credible evaluation in other jurisdictions should be permitted for market access, which is the approach that Switzerland has taken, which we think is a good interim solution until we have a durable approach agreed upon in the European Union. Now, we've seen over the last year that the response from the regulators is generally positive, but we don't see things moving. So we think we need to continue working to increase awareness and support political decisions. For that reason, we have written an open letter to the EU Health Commissioner, signed by 27 organizations in this field. We received a response by the President of the European Commission, which is highly unusual, we were told, and very encouraging, but we need to have the next steps achieved. And we are very, very happy that just now a group of members of the European Parliament have submitted a motion for a resolution to the Parliament, which has basically taken up the key demands of the pediatric community, a call for an amendment of the medical device regulation, expansion of monitoring, establishment of temporary measures, and conformity checks for devices for children to be carried out by subsidized public bodies or by limiting the fees of the notified bodies. We understand that this will now be discussed in the European Parliament, with the idea to include this in a whole statement on non-communicable diseases. And we are hopeful that the Parliament will support these proposals and then put some pressure on the member states and the Commission to move forward in a more faster way. So we think continued advocacy is needed the European Academy of Pediatrics and its member association need to and will continue to do advocacy activities both at the European and the national levels. Again, while the MDCG task force members have been open to conversations, so far we have not established a formal collaboration between the MDCG and the pediatric community, which we think is not satisfactory at all. And we really demand that this will be established. And we are committed to make the voice of children heard. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Thank you very much, Bert. And I think collectively, these presentations have given us a good overview. We're still seeing your screen, Bert. I'm sure you're planning to stop sharing. You've closed the presentation, but we still see your screen.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
Sorry for that.
I think collectively, we've had a very nice summary of what we've been able to do from CoreMD and what the problems are. And I think I'd like to start the discussion by going to Rachel Neubrander, because you're probably slightly startled that we're even talking about some of these things in Europe, because the FDA is hugely larger than the equivalent group of regulators in Europe, and you have specialists like yourself in-house, and you're able to deal with these issues. But I wonder if you would like to comment on any facts that have come up where you might have a different perspective, particularly, however, on your view of how a regulatory system can deal with the challenges that we've raised.
Sure, and thanks so much for including me. The presentations were really excellent, and I unfortunately this is not total news to me. I had heard some information about device unavailability in Europe previously, but it's really enlightening to see the details of the scope of the challenge and the efforts that you all are undertaking to address it. I think wanted to touch on a few comments from the FDA perspective about some of the underpinnings of the way we approach some of these challenging situations, and approaches and programs that we've used, recognizing that our regulatory system is very different from Europe's, but perhaps would be helpful to the conversation. I think one of the presenters pointed out the differences in both regulatory authority and charge between FDA and Europe, in that FDA does have a responsibility not only to ensure safe and effective medical devices, but really within the vision of the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, it encompasses not only safe and effective medical devices, but access in a timely manner and continued access. So we have an obligation to be aware of and try to address shortages, as well as promoting device innovation. And so we do, I think, try to take a holistic approach to all of those aspects of the benefits and risks of medical devices. I think there are kind of several principles I wanted to touch on that we rely on, particularly when we're thinking about how to address some of these really challenging products. One is that, our regulatory bar is a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness, which ties into the benefits and risks of the device, which are specific to the situation. That's kind of the foundation we're working upon. But we also have a requirement to be what we call least burdensome, which really sets the expectation on us to require the minimum amount of information needed to make the assessment of whether a device is safe and effective in the most efficient manner possible. And I think this relates to some of the challenges with respect to clinical trials, because from a perhaps more academic perspective, I totally agree that real randomized controlled trials are the gold standard, and we kind of move down the evidence chain from there. From a regulatory perspective, I think we are often challenged to find the most creative, minimally burdensome way to collect any clinical data needed. to really answer the question of, is a particular device safe and effective? So it's just, I think, a little bit different way that we think about it.
Rachel, can I ask you, is that done on a case-by-case basis for each device with you and your fellow assessors in the FDA, or are you applying different standards across all pediatric devices or orphaned products compared with what is required for adult devices with much larger numbers?
Yeah, and I think that is a particular challenge when it comes to pediatric devices, recognizing the typically small patient population and the challenges with enrolling prospective trials. I think it does end up, in contrast to the adult population where there's a much larger population and maybe many more devices in a particular area where we have some precedence or previous experience that helps us build a consistent expectation. In the pediatric world, we may be talking about a very unique device or a patient population that only has a handful of device options. And those, I think, determinations do tend to be a bit more unique and tailored to the specific situation, so that we can balance the realities of what is perhaps a doable plan for collecting clinical evidence with, will that information help us be able to decide whether a device is safe and effective?
So we have all sorts of parallels and problems, but you do have some special schemes for orphan products and devices in children.
We do.
So we could ask you briefly to summarize those, and then we can ask Marc and Bert if they think something similar in Europe is reasonable, feasible, and would address some of the problems that we've been discussing.
That's perfect. That was the second piece of things I wanted to mention, which was some of the formal programs we have. The probably most prominent one is the HTE, or Humanitarian Device Exemption regulatory pathway for Class 3 devices, which is an alternative to the more usual PMA pathway for those devices. And it's applicable to devices which are intended to treat or could be used to treat a patient population that encompasses less than 8,000 patients per year in the US. So there's a determination made up front in coordination with the Office of Orphan Product Development within FDA about whether a particular device may qualify under that scheme. And then if it's determined that the patient population is small enough to qualify, the regulatory bar for that type of device, rather than a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness, is a reasonable assurance of safety and probable benefit. So that leads to differences in the expectations for amount of clinical evidence and so on that might be required for that type of application. The two other things I wanted to mention with respect to programs that we have specific to devices is that for devices that have a pediatric specific indication, we do have user fee waiver programs. So I'm not sure if this group is aware that FDA is funded both by the government, but also in part by user fees submitted by industry when they make applications. And so for an application for a pediatric device, those user fees are waived. The other program that we have is a external program funded by FDA called the Pediatric Device Consortia program, which are external groups funded by FDA intended to support pediatric device development. So this is things like external seed funding and regulatory types of support for manufacturers who may be attempting to develop a pediatric device, which I think has been helpful. We've seen some of the devices that started out in that program make progress towards towards approval, and it's been, I think, a helpful program. So those were the kind of pediatric and orphans device specific formal programs that we have.
That's very helpful. And I think it may be useful for colleagues on the call, if they're not familiar with the European regulatory system, just to highlight that at the end of the medical device regulation, there is a clause requiring the European Commission to report to the European Parliament 5 years after the start of the new regulation. And I know with the change of dates of full application, that's a movable feast. But the final date for this report will probably be 2027, or might even be brought forward. And so the Commission are now considering changes. And so all of the things that you're mentioning to us, Rachel, may be relevant then, but it's also the context in which some of the issues that the task force that Berthold has been leading have come up with would not be feasible within the current European regulatory system. But we need to think more widely from a clinical perspective. And I'm quite sure that the ideas that you're already implementing would be very relevant here in Europe as well. But maybe I could go to you, Marc, and ask for your comments about whether you think there are any problems in the States with device availability, or whether the schemes that you're aware of that the FDA has have avoided the issues that we're now seeing in Europe.
Well, we have seen a major shift in the United States. I mean, if we compare Europe with the United States, 10 years ago, I think we were typically 2 to 3 years ahead of the United States with our devices, because it was much easier to get a device on the market in Europe. And nowadays, I mean, the last 2 years when I went to a Congress, I heard my American colleagues speak about devices that will not be available at least for the first 2 or 3 years in Europe. So probably we're lagging behind now for about 5 years, something like that. And some devices may even not get there. I heard the number. So in the United States, HDA is applicable for less than 8,000 patients a year. I presume, I had to look it up, there's about 340 million people, Americans. So that means 1 out of 42,000, one incidence for 42,000 inhabitants. That's about the same number we were talking about in Europe. And indeed, I've heard from my American colleagues that the mentality has significantly changed. And indeed, as Rachel said, FDA apparently has the obligation to ignite, to make prosper research. Some of my colleagues told me they got a phone call from the FDA telling them, here we have a device, and we think you could use it. I mean, nobody in Europe has ever got such a phone call, ever. And that's probably indeed the way to go. But for the time being, I think it will be very interesting to I mean, the United States right now is rather successful in getting new devices in the pediatric field. And indeed, I think it will be very, very important not to copy it, but I mean, get the good ideas and make sure that if a good idea comes by in Europe, that it will be also that part of the world where we can bring it to production and for the better for our patients.
Thank you. I think we'll probably come back to the issue of notified bodies and costs in a moment, but could I go to you, Bert, and ask about how you think we can be most effective as clinicians in advocating for a change, because clearly change is needed from what we've heard, and not just evolution, but some much more rapid change in certain specific ways. There is one comment on the chat about who the best advocates would be, cardiology versus colleges, and it varies from country to country. But perhaps you can advise us about the benefit of collective action through the Academy of Pediatrics or the Biomedical Alliance, and the fact that you've also spoken recently and presented your proposals to the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. So would you like to comment on how we can try to change this situation?
Yeah, first, I'd like to say that I was really impressed by what you said, Rachel. I've seen this before, of course, what was happening in the US, and I become envious, really, in many ways, because you've chosen to make some decisions which go really into the right directions. With respect to the question that Francis raised, should it not be the British Cardiovascular Society and Pediatric Cardiovascular Group that lobbies rather than the General Pediatric Association? We've heard from Marc that pediatric cardiology faces severe challenges, but I want to remind you that it's not pediatric cardiology alone. It's other areas of child health that are also very much effective. For example, we've heard that dialysis machines for small children are disappearing, and there is no solution anymore for children with renal failure. So it's not entirely a cardiological problem. So that's why I think we need to join forces with all of pediatric medicine to make ourselves heard, and we are stronger together. That's why the European Academy of Pediatrics has gathered all these many associations who come up with the same messages to try to influence decision makers. And the good thing is, if we talk about the health of children being challenged by the current regulatory environment, then politicians listen, because nobody wants to harm children. Nobody wants to do something that is not serving the needs of children. So that's a good thing. The difficult thing is to change reality from a basic understanding. And again, I think we can only achieve it if not everybody marches in a different direction, but if we join forces and work together. Alan, you mentioned the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, where I had an opportunity to speak to the regulators from around the world. It was hosted by the European Commission, but involved regulators from the United States, from Australia, from Brazil, from Japan, from all over the world, who work together on these issues. And the response was generally very positive. I'm just wondering whether there is enough interaction between, for example, FDA and European Commission, so that European Commission can learn from the experience of FDA in this area. And we suggested that they should develop a task force specifically to address pediatric medical device challenges. I'm not sure whether they've taken up that proposal, but it was at least discussed. So that's one element. I think we have a lot of issues still to be addressed and to be solved. I'm not optimistic it's going to be fast, but I'm motivated that we keep pushing.
There are a couple of issues that I think we could discuss, but let me follow up quickly with you, Rachel, on one specificity about global convergence or regulatory collaboration through IMDA for others. And take the example of dialysis, because there was a paper in Kidney International, I think earlier this year, showing that there is no regulatory system worldwide that has been able to approve on the basis of evidence a specific neonatal or small child dialysis system. So I don't know how the kidney specialists cope, but that something like that is clearly something that globally such a specialist need ought to be evaluated. And you couldn't do a trial, but you could collect data. So I wonder if you'd like to comment, A, on whether regulators can collaborate to provide the evidence that we've heard from Kathrin doesn't exist, and B, what FDA thinks is the responsibility of each of us as clinicians to contribute to registries. And that would apply both for Marc's problems with off-label use, but specifically when there is so little pre-market data.
These are great questions, and I do want to say I also come from the cardiology world, so we'll try not to limit my comments to cardiology because I recognize that there is a broader issue. So your first comment about, or question about, kind of regulators working together on device approval challenges, I think there can be challenges because every country has its own regulatory process and requirements. However, I think one example I would highlight as one place where we have had some success in collaborating is between the US and Japan through the Harmonization by Doing program, which is an effort between our two countries to coordinate and collaborate on regulatory requirements for particular devices. And there's actually a working subgroup within that broader effort on pediatric devices in particular. So I think that's one small way perhaps that we've been trying to work together. I think to do it on a global level would certainly present more challenges, but would be an ideal situation if we could agree, across many countries on what the regulatory requirements might be for a particular device type.
And the second question was about responsibilities of clinicians to collect data. And I'll come back to Marc on that after you.
Yeah, and that's another great one because I think in the US, we've seen the utility of clinical registries, both in the adult and pediatric space, for both post-market surveillance, as was really nicely highlighted in some of the presentations, as well as for collecting data that could be used to support a pre-market application. So, for example, we recently were able to grant a PMA approval to one of those many stents. I don't think it was on Marc's particular list, but one of those many stents that is extensively used off-label in pediatric pulmonary artery stenosis on the basis of registry data that had been collected on those uses. And so I think that was one way we were able to use existing data to move a device from off-label to on-label use, but we could not have done that without that data being in the registry, being complete, being well entered, correctly entered by the physician. So I think data entry into registries is really powerful. To me, it fits under the umbrella of regulators, the clinical community, and industry all working together to try to solve some of these problems. And that's the approach that we've taken at FDA, particularly with respect to pediatric devices.
Absolutely. And thank you. And I would make the comment that you need those people for them to be able to work together in the European system, the way it's organized. It's not easy.
Could I just underline quickly the benefit of having a harmonized approach for certifying pediatric devices across jurisdictions, because we really have a problem in not having enough innovative pediatric devices developed. And you have addressed this already with your funding scheme to try to stimulate the development of more devices. Now, wouldn't it be a great step forward if a developer of a device that is only sold in small numbers knows, if I get it evaluated to the same standards, I can sell it in the US, in Europe, in Japan, in Australia. I mean, that would really stimulate the development of more innovation in the interest of patients.
Totally agree.
Thank you, Bert. I'm sure we agree. Can I come to Marc and ask you, we've had meetings with regulators and colleagues in the European Commission, and they have told us on several occasions that they do not want to see devices disappear, but they are also not fully informed. And I want to ask you about how you think we can address this issue of trying to monitor what is happening so that there is chance before devices disappear to ask for derogations and to collect data that can pressurize the political system to reform.
Indeed. The system of derogations does not seem to work very nicely. In Europe, for the time being, there's two kinds of derogations you can get. either by competent authorities by the country itself. So that means every country can decide for itself. And usually that's for a limited of time, typically 6 months, to be renewed. The European Commission can decide also themselves to derogate a device for the whole of Europe. But to my knowledge, this has never happened before. Yeah. And again, it is unclear from whom the question should come. And typically, we use things like that off-label. I think the question should come from the company to get a derogation from Europe, but they will never be able to do it for an off-label indication of their own device. And there you're in a deadlock. Sorry, that was one of the.
But I think you've set up a registry yourselves, or you're using a registry now to collect data as well.
Right. Well, we have been we started this year throughout Europe a registry for procedures and to see for risk management of procedures. And we are working now on adding a chapter on those procedures, a little chapter for including devices. Yeah. The big problem with that, however, is we now have in Europe a very tough GDPR legislation that requires extensive and renewable permission of every patient and or parent that they allow us to use the data. So we have been playing with the idea indeed of, for instance, if a device gets the status of an orphan device, that obligatory the results of that device should be put into a database that takes away immediately all the problems of paperwork in order to include and keep included through the GDPR legislation. And just sharing that information from my center now, I have to go through my ethical committee, share it. It has to cross a border in Europe. That's again another big issue. Who's going to be responsible for the data? Who's going to keep it? Who can consult the data and things like that? It's a lot of big legal issues that at this point we're discussing and try to come with a workable thing. But here we see that there's still a lot of work to be done throughout Europe. I mean, we think there are no borders, but once you start on working these things, there are still major borders across Europe.
So thank you. I think the initiative is commendable, but you're raising a lot of secondary issues that we're aware of. And indeed, we've been looking at those with other tasks within our consortium. I think, let me just finish with one or two more questions. And I wonder, Bert, whether you would like to address the comment in the Q&A, which is about notified bodies being risk averse now. I'm not sure any of us are the right people to answer this question, but I personally would say this is down to transparency, the fact that we don't know what evidence individual notified bodies are going to expect, and that we can't see what standards they've applied, mean that they are risk averse, as Marc said, and they're overcomplicating the review process because of the new requirements. And they are indeed also inspected regularly by committees from the European Commission and from national regulatory agencies. And so they may feel that they have to meet those standards. So part of the longer term reform may be the notified body system and its transparency. But I know this is probably too big a topic for us to solve, but I wonder if you have any comments on that question.
Well, it's understandable. If you talk to politicians and the public, the expectation is that there should be no risk with any product sold. In medicine, of course, we agree. We don't want to harm our patients. We want to have a low-risk approach. But I like what Rachel, you said before. we want to have a reasonable assurance of safety and probable benefit. I like that wording, and that's what we do in medicine. In medicine, nothing is 100% safe. We're always living with residual risk, and we try to weigh risk against benefit. And if we have a good relationship between benefit and risk, then we go forward in the interest of the patient. And I wish that notified bodies and regulators would try to adopt this and look at both risk and benefit, and then learn to live with a situation where you cannot guarantee a zero risk in real life. It's just not possible with anything we do. If we go into a car, we know we don't have a zero risk. We still drive cars. And I think that needs to be sort of implemented in a reasonable approach to evaluating also products that we use in medicine.
And so we probably need more guidance on devices in children, and perhaps specific standards as well in future. But I think I can close the discussion now, unless anyone has burning points they would like to come back with. And thank you all for your excellent contributions and for this interesting discussion. And I'm quite sure we haven't solved the problems, but we've aired them, and we'll continue to work to try and improve the European system through EAP, through the Biomed Alliance, through our consortium, and through our membership of the Orphan Devices Task Force of European Union regulators, where we are presenting these proposals also. So thank you for your participation, and I encourage you to join future webinars that you'll find on the CoreMD website. Thank you very much.